So today's lesson is going to seem like a pretty easy topic. We're going to talk about federalism. Federalism, very simply, is where the federal government and the state government share power. So maybe you've taken a field trip to Washington, D.C., that's your federal government, or maybe you've taken a field trip to Columbia, which is the capital of South Carolina, and you've seen your state government. So federalism is where these two governments work together. Students often get federalism confused with Federalist, or the word federal. The Federalist Party was a party that wanted a strong federal government. So it's all related, but it's different things. Federalism is dividing the power between a central or national government and state governments. So for federal government, think Washington, D.C. and the president. State governments think Columbia and the governor. Okay, so don't get Federalist and Federalism and federal all confused. Make sure you understand the difference between them. So there are national laws and there are state laws in a federalist system. So different states can have different laws. For example, you might be familiar with in the state of Colorado, how you can legally buy and sell marijuana. Don't try that in South Carolina. So states can have different laws because under federalism, each state has its own government. For example, handguns are an interesting example. There's a national law in the Constitution that everyone has the right to bear arms. However, each state chooses to interpret that law as to who and where can have handguns, where they can be seen. Some states allow for concealed weapon permits and allow for people to carry weapons in their cars, but this varies from state to state. So why federalism? Well, the founders knew that they did not want a unitary system like in England or a confederal system, which they had tried under the Articles of the Confederation. So we need to know what a unitary and a confederal system are. So a unitary system is what England had, and it's where all of the power is held in a central government. So yes, there are smaller municipal governments, but they have no power. They all have to do what the central government says. They all have to do what England and, London and Parliament say. So this is not a completely bad thing. The laws of the country are very unified. There's no confusion. No matter where you live in England, if you live in London or Edinburgh, all the laws are exactly the same. You can also eliminate some government waste, right? Because you're not duplicating jobs. Everything comes from the central government down versus in federalism, you have two Congresses, you have a president, you have a governor, there's a lot of duplication in federalism. But the founding fathers, of course, were very much afraid of a strong central government. Then they came from states where they were very independent and had their own ideas and agendas. So the first government of the United States was actually the Articles of the Confederation. They went to the other extreme and used a confederal system. Confederal system is where the government has a state and federal government, but the states hold all the power. The central government serves the states. The states, of course, like this because tyranny could be avoided. The central government doesn't have a lot of power. The states were different with different needs and ideas. Of course, the big one that comes to mind is slavery and economics. The North was very into manufacturing, while the South was very agricultural. So under the Articles of the Confederation, the states had a lot of independence and the central government served the states. But of course, we know that that didn't work. And it had to be revised and rewritten, and we got the Constitution, which was a compromise between that unitary system and the confederal system, federalism. So the states and the federal governments are going to work together for the common good of the nation. So let's look at what the federal government can do in the Constitution. The Constitution says very specifically what the federal government has the powers to do. And they are laid out as delegated powers, or sometimes they're called enumerated powers, these are implied powers and inherent powers. And there are three different kinds of powers, and you need to know what each three does. So let's look at the first one, delegated powers or enumerated powers. This is pretty easy. These are things that the Constitution has explicitly written down. It says the federal government can do this. So this is in Article 1, Section 8, and it simply lists them. There are 27 delegated powers to the federal government, and these are things that you sort of expect, like coining money. You can't have individual states creating their own money, as they were doing under the Articles of the Confederation. Maintaining an army, that's something that the federal government needs to do. You can't have individual states with their own militias. The post office. Think about if South Carolina only had a South Carolina post office. How would you get things to New York? So the post office sort of came underneath those delegated, written out powers. Treaties with foreign countries, to regulate commerce with foreign nations. So delegated powers are pretty simple. It's those 27 powers that are explicitly written. But here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Implied powers. Implied powers are things that are not stated in the Constitution but can be implied that the federal government should do it. This is where we get the growth of federal programs and the growth of government, or federal government. This comes from what's called the elastic clause, or the necessary and proper cause, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. This provision gives Congress the right to make all laws which shall be deemed necessary and proper for carrying into execution and for the foregoing powers and other powers vested in the government of the United States. So this clause made the Constitution flexible or elastic. It allowed it to stretch as the country grew and as we moved into the future, because obviously the Founding Fathers, they hadn't seen cars, they hadn't seen really even railroads or the internet. So this is an important clause because it allows the Constitution to grow with the nation, that it is elastic. But it does allow for the federal government to become pretty big. So let's look at some of how that happens with the implied powers. So for example, if the government is given a delegated power of collecting taxes, what does the government do with all that money? Wouldn't it be considered necessary and proper for there to be a national bank? For example, if Congress has the power to raise an army, and if Congress deems it necessary and proper that this army should be filled with a national draft, that would maybe be deemed necessary and proper that it should do so. So here's where it gets even hazier. Consider phrases like commerce. Congress has the obligation to protect the general welfare. These things can be pretty broad. So example things that come out of the government's ability to handle commerce and to provide for the general welfare have led to things like laws on pollution, equal opportunity laws, minimum wage. So the last power that we're going to look at is inherent powers, and it's pretty simple. These are powers that exist in essence because there's a government. There's not many inherent powers, but some of them are things like to control the country's borders, right? I mean, obviously that just because there's a government, that's just what it does. Other things are like the ability to accept or refuse diplomatic countries, acquire new territory for national expansion. Like the purpose of government, obviously, is to protect the country and prevent revolutions. So basically things that because there's a government, the government has these powers. But don't forget about the states. That's all federal government. But what does the state government do? What does the Constitution say it has the power to do? Now we call the powers that the state has, we call them reserve powers, because the Constitution, when it was written, says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, not prohibited to the states, are reserved to the state respectively or to the people. So that's why we call them reserve powers. These are powers that don't go to the national government and are reserved for the states. Things like local taxes, marriage license, conducting local elections. The states do have prohibited powers, meaning these are powers that are denied to the state government. They can't levy taxes on imports and exports from the state. They can't interfere with treaties with foreign countries. They can't violate the Bill of Rights. Of course, the national government can't violate the Bill of Rights too. But there are prohibited powers as well. So this is what we're trying to get to. This is what federalism looks like if you're familiar with a Venn diagram. Venn diagrams, you have two circles. One circle, the blue circle, is what the national government can do. These are all the things that it's laid out in the Constitution. The yellow circle is what's given to the states. And then you have something called concurrent powers. And this is the green, where they sort of overlap. So if you can keep this Venn diagram in your mind, you'll have a pretty good idea of how federalism works. But federalism is not so simple. It's not just everybody gets along hunky-dory. Just because the Constitution lays out what the federal government can do and what the states can do, it doesn't mean that it's always everybody gets along. There's always an argument of who has the final say, who has more power. Is it the federal government or the state government? And this is debated all through history, and it changes through history on if the states have more power or if the federal government has more power. It depends on where you are in history. So, for example, can the national government create a law and force the states to follow and do it? Do the states have the ability to say certain federal laws are not valid and say, no, we're not going to do that? For example, this is one of the contributing factors to the Civil War. Nullification or states' rights. They said that the federal government didn't have the right to tell them that they couldn't have slaves, right? Or slave states. So the idea that state laws should supersede federal laws. More modern day examples would be things like gay marriage. Marriage licenses are issued by the states. So if a state doesn't want to allow gay marriage, can the state say that this federal law doesn't apply to them? Gun laws. Can the United States pass a blanket gun law that says everyone has to have a license for a gun? Mandated health care. Do all the states have to provide health care? Should all the states have an exact same minimum wage? Does California's minimum wage have to match South Carolina's minimum wage? So the balance between the two is very debated and can become controversial even today. But we have this idea of the federal government always being on top, right? We sort of think, well, doesn't the federal laws always supersede state laws? Not always. And this idea actually was not written in the Constitution. It was actually came about through the Supreme Court and judicial review. So there were two court cases that solidified the idea that federal laws should supersede state laws, and that is McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch versus Maryland is when the Congress or the federal government decided that they wanted to open a national bank, right? They said that, hey, we need a national bank. We collect all these taxes. It's an implied power that we have. So they put a national bank in Maryland, and that's competition, right? The Maryland bank is now in competition with the national bank. And so Maryland decides to tax the national bank, trying to get it out of their state. So McCulloch brings this case and is trying to sue this and basically sues the state of Maryland to stop taxing them. It says Maryland can't tax a national bank, that it is it's within their federal purview to come into a state, and the state says, no, it's our right to tax. And John Marshall, who you might remember from Marbury versus Madison, says that the federal law allows the national bank to exist, and Maryland cannot tax it out of existence. Again, this is going to use that sort of elastic clause in the Constitution and solidify that, hey, federal laws are over state laws. The other court case that brought federal laws to prominence was Gibson versus Ogden. So you have the Commerce Clause, right? And it says that the federal government has the right to regulate commerce. Very broad. And so New York has a steamship, and it's trading up and down the river, and the national government gives a charter to a steamboat company. And they're in competition. And so basically you have New York saying, hey, I have exclusive rights to operate this steamship in these waters. I'm a New York steamship. And then you have the United States saying, no, we regulate interstate commerce. I can be here. Gibson versus Ogden, John Marshall is going to declare that federal law, again, is above state law, and that Congress has the authority to regulate interstate trade, including shipping. So we know how federalism works, but there are two types of federalism that have developed. Federalism first developed, it was called dual federalism. And it's the concept that the national and state governments are each involved in their own spheres of influence and that they don't merge, right? You've got the federal government and it does what it does, and you have the state government and it does what it does, and the local government does what it does, and they don't mix. So a lot of times people call this the layer cake, or dual federalism, because the layers don't mix. However, as we progress through history, we start seeing the layers of government becoming more intertwined. And so people compare this to a marble cake, where the federal government starts getting involved in the state stuff, and the state stuff starts creeping around maybe into the local things, and the layers between federal, state, and local governments is not so clearly defined. And this is called cooperative federalism. So for an example of dual federalism would be something like the federal government is completely responsible for foreign policy, and the states are solely responsible for education. Cooperative federalism would be something like the state and federal governments working together to build an interstate highway system. So how do state and federal governments work together? How does the federal government get the states to do things, things that maybe the states don't want to do? And they do this through what's called mandates. Mandates are requirements imposed by the federal government on states and local government. So in practice, the federal government can mandate that a state adopts certain policies or do certain things. But how does it actually get the states to do what it asks? It does it through giving money. The federal government gives money to states, and the state often will comply with the federal mandates because they don't want to lose this money. So states get money from the government in three ways. They can get it in grants and aid. Now, grants and aid are for specific projects that the state needs done, but the state has little say in how that money is spent. It's very much controlled by the federal government. The states can get money in the form of categorical grants. These are things for very specific things. Or they can get general grants, which is broad discretion for the state. And so the state can just take the money and use it where it's needed. So there's three different types of grants, all with a different amount of strings attached to that money. Now, the government can issue unfunded mandates, and that's where no money is given, and usually those are not so popular. So, for example, let's say Congress wants to raise the drinking age from 18 to 21. So in order for the individual states to continue to qualify for federal funds for interstate highway systems in each state, they have to raise the drinking age. So we have now looked at how state and federal governments work and how they're funded and how they get things done. And in the next lesson, we're going to look at the federal government a little bit more closely.